Could you talk a little bit about the embedding issue with the Iraq War? Because my sense of it is that journalistic access to the battlefields was really limited during Desert Storm, and that journalists were frustrated by that, and so people weren't satisfied with the rules of engagement during that conflict. So then we have the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and journalists wanted more.
Yeah.
And
well, there was no embedding in the first Gulf War.
Yeah.
All the journalists were stuck basically in Riyadh or Tehran, and they only later were they allowed to go in. But when the 24th Mechanized Infantry went into Iraq, or the Marines went into Kuwait, they didn't take journalists along on the ride. All that changed in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq and did have embedded journalists. And we remember, David Bloom of NBC, Walter Rogers of CNN. They went in. We had the live cameras, and they were reporting as they were driving towards Baghdad. So I was in Kuwait at the time, anchoring our coverage for 4 or 5 weeks before the actual war started, and then during the war. But it was a very different situation. Was it perfect, the embedding arrangement? No, it wasn't perfect. It was certainly a lot better than it was in 1991, when we basically had virtually no access to the front lines.
Did CNN, though, try to negotiate with the Pentagon about these rules and wanting, this
it wasn't just CNN.
Express some unhappiness about the limitations?
All of the television news networks are part of a pool, a network pool we call it, whether with the Pentagon, the White House, Capitol Hill, and we go in as a team. And this kind of, when you're negotiating access and rules of engagement, stuff like that, it's not just CNN, it's CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, we all go in together, all the bureau chiefs in Washington, and they make their presentation, and because we have an interest, all the news organizations are having access. The government, whether the Pentagon or whatever, their interest is limiting our access. So we fight it out with them. And some administrations are more open than others. But that's just the nature of the beast, if you will. But it's not just CNN, it's all of us as a group.
But how do you think that all worked out?
I think it worked out better than in 1991, but it wasn't perfect. 2005, I went to Iraq and embedded with General Abizaid, who was then the central commander, U.S. military central command. And we spent a week. We went to Mosul and Fallujah and Baghdad, all over the place. And I had access. Did I have access to everything? No. Were there classified meetings that he went into with his generals? He said, you have to stay out? Of course. I understood that. But I did have access to troops in areas that I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. If I would have just, flying into Baghdad, I'm going to see what I can see. I wouldn't have had access to those kinds of military facilities, Iraqi military, that I had because I was embedded in his group.
Yeah. What about the concern that the reporters would get too chummy with the soldiers, they would be dependent on them for their safety, and so it would be harder for them to ask the tough questions, to be more objective? Do you think any of that was a problem?
I don't think it was a problem. I think I was a Pentagon correspondent, I covered wars. I think the soldiers, the rank and file, they like having media there. They want us to tell their story. They're proud of what they're doing, and they want us to get the access. And they know that not everything is going to be a great positive story, but they don't care. That's my impression over the years in working with rank and file troops.
I also wanted to go back to the run-up to the Iraq War, and when people look back now, and I know both the New York Times and the Washington Post printed these sort of mea culpas that we were too credulous, we focused sort of overmuch on the administration's case for the war, and not enough on the skeptics who were saying, well, wait a minute, he doesn't really have the weapons of mass destruction. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence of any kind of cahoots between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. When you look back on that coverage now, how do you evaluate it?
I think we could have done a better job. It's hard. We did have skeptics on my shows. I had Dr. Hans Blix, who was the UN weapons inspector. I had Dr. Mohammed al-Baradei, the nuclear the IAEA Secretary General. I had skeptics who were on saying, well, it's not true. And even some members of Congress, Senator Bob Graham of Florida was a skeptic, and I had him on often. On the other hand, when the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Head of the Intelligence, CIA, they're all telling Congress and the American public and the United Nations, here is the evidence of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. You got to report that. I mean, if the CIA director says that, if Colin Powell, that was the secretary, goes before the United Nations Security Council with his pictures and diagrams, and you got to report that. Should we have been more skeptical in our reporting? Probably. Certainly now that we know that there were no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, and there was not much of a nuclear program, if at all, no biological or chemical weapons. They had a capability to develop them, but they didn't have any. And Saddam Hussein wanted us to believe that he had it, so to intimidate his enemies and to try to deter the U.S. and the others from invading them, so that he didn't deny it. But certainly, look, journalism is the first draft of history, and we do our best. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. Can we always do a better job? Yes. Could we have done a better job then? I'm sure we could have. It wasn't as if we totally ignored the other side. And remember, we were also getting confirmation from all of the other allies that Saddam Hussein had this. The British and the French, they were all agreeing with the U.S. And even some of the Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, they weren't disputing. So you did have the French who were saying, he may have it, but there are other ways of dealing with it other than going to war. You don't necessarily have to go to war. You can put them in a box and contain them, and sanctions and diplomatic pressure, stuff like that. So there was a dispute about whether or not the invasion was necessary. And we reported all of that. Scholars like you will continue to study that and see if we could have done a better job.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about had to do, we've had coverage of the earthquake in Haiti and Hurricane Katrina and tsunami and earthquake in Japan. And these are instances where the dilemma of how much the reporters get involved in helping victims of disasters, and the argument is, be a human being first, be a journalist second. If someone needs your help, help them. The critics say there's some grandstanding involved. You've got people on, reporters on TV, and they become the story, and they're looking like heroes. Do those kinds of issues get discussed?
There may be some reporters who are grandstanding, but I know for a fact that some of our reporters, they've done really amazing things, whether in a story like that, or Katrina, or the earthquake in Haiti. We have one, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who's a neurosurgeon, but he's also a journalist. He's saved lives. He's taken off his journalistic hat and gone into the operating room and tried to save lives in some of because he knows, as much as he's a journalist, he's a doctor first. And as much as he's a doctor, he's a human being first. So most responsible journalists, there are some who are, movie stars and grandstanding, but I think most, if they could do something to save somebody's life, forget about the journalism.
I guess the critics say that do that stuff off camera. Don't do it on camera, because otherwise you draw too much attention to yourself.
But yeah, on the other hand, I can understand that. On the other hand, the viewers and the readers, they're interested in that. It would be suppressing news if a reporter did something that was really important in saving somebody's life. What's wrong with letting everybody know about that? I don't have a problem with that. If that's news, if Sanjay Gupta goes out there and the U.S. Navy doctors say, we don't have a neurosurgeon, we've got a sailor who's about to die, can you help us? I don't have a problem with Sanjay doing that. And I certainly don't have a problem with letting our viewers know that Sanjay did that. I don't think that's ethical problem as far as I'm concerned.